Hello everyone. Rowlatt Act, Satyagraha, and Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. While on the one hand the government dangled the carrot of constitutional reforms, though of an unsatisfactory order, on the other hand it decided to arm itself with extraordinary powers to suppress any discordant voice against the reforms. The Rowlatt Act. Just 6 months before the Montfort reforms were to be put into effect, two bills were introduced in the Imperial Legislative Council. One of them was dropped, but the other, an extension to the Defence of India Regulations Act 1915, was passed in March 1919. It was what was officially called the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act, but popularly known as the Rowlatt Act. It was based on the recommendations made in the previous year to the Imperial Legislative Council by the Rowlatt Commission headed by the British Judge Sir Sidney Rowlatt to investigate the seditious conspiracy of the Indian people. The committee had recommended that activists should be deported or imprisoned without trial for 2 years, and that even possession of seditious newspapers would be adequate evidence of guilt. All the elected Indian members of the Imperial Legislative Council voted against the bill, but they were in a minority and easily overruled by the official nominees. All the elected Indian members, who included Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Madan Mohan Malaviya, and Malar ul Haq, resigned in protest. The act allowed political activists to be tried without juries or even imprisoned without trial. It allowed arrest of Indians without warrant on the mere suspicion of treason. Such suspects could be tried in secrecy without recourse to legal help. A special cell consisting of three High Court judges was to try such suspects, and there was no court of appeal above that panel. This panel could even accept the evidence not acceptable under the Indian Evidences Act. The law of habeas corpus, the basis of civil liberty, was sought to be suspended. The object of the government was to replace the repressive provisions of the Wartime Defence of India Act 1915 by a permanent law. So the wartime restrictions on freedom of speech and assembly were reimposed in India. There was strict control over the press, and the government was armed with a variety of powers to deal with anything the authorities chose to consider as terrorism or revolutionary tactics. Satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act, first mass strike. Just when the Indians expected a huge advance towards self rule as a reward for their contribution to the war, they were given the Montfort reforms with its very limited scope and the shockingly repressive Rowlatt Act. Not surprisingly, the Indians felt betrayed, more so Gandhi, who had been at the forefront in offering cooperation in the British war effort and who had even offered to encourage in recruitment of Indians into the British Indian forces. He called the Rowlatt Act the Black Act and argued that not everyone should get punishment in response to isolated political crimes. Gandhi called for a mass protest at all India level, but soon, having seen the constitutional protest met with ruthless repression, Gandhi organized a Satyagraha Sabha and roped in younger members of Home Rule Leagues and the Pan Islamists. The forms of protest finally chosen included observance of a national-wide Hartal strike accompanied by fasting and prayer and civil disobedience against specific laws and courting arrest and imprisonment. There was a radical change in the situation by now. The masses had found a direction. Now they could act instead of giving verbal expression at their grievances. From now onwards, peasants, artisans, and the urban poor were to play an increasingly important part in the struggle. Orientation of the national movement turned to the masses permanently. Gandhi said that salvation would come when masses were awakened and became active in politics. Satyagraha was to be launched on April 6, 1919, but before it could be launched, there were large scale violent anti British demonstrations in Calcutta, Bombay, Delhi, Ahmedabad, etc. Especially in Punjab, the situation became so very explosive due to wartime repression, forcible recruitments, and ravages of disease that the army had to be called in. April 1919 saw the biggest and the most violent anti-British upset since 1857. The Governor of Punjab, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, is said to have used aircraft strafing against the violent protesters. Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, April 13, 1919. Amritsar was the worst affected by violence. In the beginning, there was no violence by the protesters. Indians shut down their shops and normal trade, and the empty streets showed the Indians' displeasure at the British betrayal. On April 9, two nationalist leaders, Saifuddin Kichlew and Dr. Satyapal, were arrested by the British officials without any provocation, except that they had addressed protest meetings and taken to some unknown destination. This caused resentment among the Indian protesters who came out in thousands on April 10 to show their solidarity with their leaders. Soon the protests turned violent because the police resorted to firing, in which some of the protesters were killed. Tension ran high. In the riot that followed, five Englishmen are reported to have been killed, and Marcella Sherwood, an Englishwoman missionary going on a bicycle, was beaten up. Troops were sent immediately to quell the disturbances. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer was the senior British officer with the responsibility to impose martial law and restore order. By then, the city had returned to calm, and the protests that were being held were peaceful. Dyer, however, issued a proclamation on April 13, which was also Baishaki, forbidding people from leaving the city without a pass and from organizing demonstrations or processions or assembling in groups of more than three. On Baisakhi Day, a large crowd of people, mostly from neighboring villages, unaware of the prohibitory orders in the city, gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh, a popular place for public events, to celebrate the Baishakhi festival. Local leaders had also called for a protest meeting at the venue. It is not clear how many in the 20,000 odd people collected there were political protesters, but the majority were those who had collected for the festival. Meanwhile, the meeting had gone peacefully, and two resolutions, one calling for the repeal of the Rowlatt Act and the other condemning the firing on April 10th, had been passed. It was then that Brigadier General Dyer arrived on the scene with his men. The troops surrounded the gathering under orders from General Dyer and blocked the only exit point and opened fire on the unarmed crowd. No warning was issued, no instruction to disperse was given. An unarmed gathering of men, women, and children was fired upon as they tried to flee. According to the official British Indian sources, 379 were identified dead and approximately 1,100 were wounded. The Indian National Congress, on the other hand, estimated more than 1,500 were injured and approximately 1,000 were killed. But it is precisely known that 1,650 bullets were fired into the crowd. The incident was followed by uncivilized brutalities on the inhabitants of Amritsar. Martial law was proclaimed in Punjab, and public floggings and other humiliations were perpetrated. To take just one instance, Indians were forced to crawl on their bellies down the road on which the English missionary had been assaulted. The entire nation was stunned. Rabindranath Tagore renounced his knighthood in protest. Gandhi gave up the title of Kaisar-e-Hind bestowed by the British for his work during the Boer War. Gandhi was overwhelmed by the atmosphere of total violence and withdrew the movement on April 18, 1919. Seen in an objective way, Dyer ensured the beginning of the end of the British Raj. What happened in Amritsar made Gandhi declare that cooperation with the Satanic regime was now impossible. He realized that the cause of Indian independence from British rule was morally righteous. The way to the non-cooperation movement was ready. According to the historian A.P.J. Taylor, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was the decisive moment when Indians were alienated from the British rule. The events of 1919 were to shape Punjab's politics of resistance. Bhagat Singh was just 11 at the time of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. For Bhagat Singh's Bharat Naujawan Sabha, the massacre was to act as a symbol that would help overcome the apathy that came in the wake of the end of the non-cooperation movement. Udham Singh, who bore the name Ram Mohammed Singh Azad, later assassinated Michael O'Dwyer, the governor who presided over the brutal British suppression of the 1919 protests in Punjab. Udham Singh was hanged in 1940 for his deed. His ashes were returned to India in 1974. Like, share and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you. Bye.